Mantua makers and the rise of the female dressmaker. When we think of 18th century garments, we often think of huge amounts of opulence with silk gowns covered in ruches and frills and lace and embroidery and all manner of decoration. These confectionaries were mainly the work of female dressmakers and milliners, who for the first time in European history were working as legal guilds rather than simply individual women. The story of how this came about is not entirely straightforward, and we can in fact trace it back to 16th century Japan. To give a bit of backstory, I'm going to have to go into a bit of complicated trade between Japan and various other people in order to explain how all of this connection comes about. So if we start off in 16th century Japan, the Portuguese arrive in 1545. And they are able to take advantage of the fact that there are currently various trade embargoes going on between Japan and China. And so they're able to facilitate shipping between the two countries. They use Jesuit priests as their interpreters. To massively simplify this, Jesuit priests are basically a branch of the Catholic Church who mainly aim to convert to Catholicism the people that they run across, whether that's the Protestants in England at this time, or whether it's people in lands further afield from Europe who have never heard of Christianity and are now going to be made very aware of it whether they like it or not. The Portuguese are trading in Japan from about 1545 or so, with this whole let's convert everyone to Christianity going along. And then the Dutch arrive in the 1590s. They're not massively fussed about embarking on too much trade with the Japanese at the moment because they are focusing more of their interests elsewhere, but they begin to play a bigger role as the 17th century begins. So in 1632, this is moving a bit further forward now, so 40 years later, Shogun Iemitsu, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing his name correctly, please feel free to correct me in the comments. He arrives at his full ascendancy. He's sort of been ruling, it's complicated, but he's sort of been ruling in Japan beforehand, but he is now full shogun and in full control. So he is able to enact more policies than he was beforehand. These are a lot of anti-Christian policies on account of the fact that he sees this block of Christians that the Portuguese have sort of created in Japan as a threat to his power because they are, at least in part, in opposition to him. He also looks towards isolating Japan from the rest of the world in order to protect it. These anti-Christian policies put the Dutch on a bit of the higher ground than the Portuguese on account of the fact that the Dutch are not using Jesuit priests as their translators, and they're not particularly fussed about converting all of the Japanese to Catholicism or indeed any form of Christianity. Anyway, these anti-Christian policies come to a bit of a head in 1637 with the Shimabara Rebellion, wherein there is essentially a massive uprising against these anti-Christian policies, and there's also, as with many rebellions, there are multiple reasons for these people rising up, including the fact that the peasants are not being particularly well treated by their lords and there is high taxation. In the process of putting down this rebellion, Shogun Iemitsu has thousands of people killed, and because of the fact that the majority of the people rebelling were Christian, he uses this as an excuse to kick out the Portuguese. He also uses it to isolate the Dutch, so they are only permitted onto the artificial island of Deshima just outside of Nagasaki. And with that, he finalises the whole shutting off of Japan from everywhere else. So if you are a Japanese citizen and you are outside of Japan, you are not allowed to return, and if you are in Japan, you are not allowed to leave. However, there are Japanese settlements in Siam, Queenam and Tonkin, and so the Dutch prove very useful to the Japanese in providing shipping to and from these settlements when Japanese aren't allowed to arrive on or leave Japan. As well as shipping goods between Japanese settlements, the Dutch are also able to provide shipping between Japan and China and Taiwan and Thailand and Europe as well. Deshima, as the only place in which foreigners can be seen, proves to be quite the tourist attraction when people come to Nagasaki, and there are all sorts of souvenirs that can be bought to remember these strange foreign people. The Dutch retain their monopoly on the whole trade between Japan and the rest of the world until the reopening of Japan in the 19th century. And as such, it does mean that Japanese scholars especially had a slightly warped view of the European world in the meantime. So they had very much a Dutch-centric view of how Europe was, and it was slightly odd for them to discover upon being able to go to Europe that Dutch was not the main language spoken in Europe and that Holland was not the centre of European affairs. Anyway, you are probably wondering what all of this has to do with 18th century gowns. Each year, in renewing the trade agreement, the shogun would grant the Dutch 30 silk gowns, or kimonos. Literally translated, kimono means clothing, and these are relatively simply shaped garments. They're a sort of T-shape, front opening that you can then wrap around, tie with a belt. I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail about kimonos here because I have neither the time nor the expertise, but if you want to look more into kimonos and the history of them and how they've evolved over time, I have attached some sources below, many of which are freely available on the internet. Essentially all we need to know is that this is what a kimono looks like and that they were granted to the Dutch each year as part of the trade agreement. Because there are only 30 of these garments coming into Holland each year, they were naturally highly desirable and incredibly expensive. The limited supply of them made them very, very high status garments. And as with all things where there is a very low supply and a high demand, cheaper knockoffs soon begin to be made, both in Europe and in Asia. These garments soon become known by many different names. We've got Japanese gowns from the whole kimonos being imported from Japan, so they're Japanese. We've got morning gowns because you could wear them informally in the morning when you're getting up, when you're brushing your hair, when you're eating breakfast. They're also known as night gowns because you can be wearing them as you're getting undressed before you're going to bed. They get known as dressing gowns because you can wear them when you're getting dressed or before you're getting dressed. They are also known weirdly as banyans. Banyan comes from the Gujarati word for a Hindu trader. I'm not quite sure how this name became attached to these Japanese gowns. Possibly it's because of the fact that there are replicas of them being made in India at the time. They are a really convenient garment to make copies of, to make multiple off-the-peg versions of, on account of the fact that they don't require a great deal of fitting. Unlike the stays or the bodices or the highly tailored coats that you might find in the 17th century, these gowns are really loose and free-flowing and will fit most people. They're adopted as informal wear for men first and then women adopt them. You wear them over the top of, if you're a man, over your shirt and your breeches, if you're a woman, over your stays and your petticoats, so you're not fully dressed. It's useful as another layer for warmth. It's also brilliant for showing off your status. Not only do you have the leisure time to be wearing this garment instead of getting dressed into your work clothes, you also have the money to have an extra garment to be wearing in your leisure time. They can be acquired from various places. There are tailors, there are gown warehouses that specifically sell off-the-peg garments. These can be higher end, these can be lower, aimed for people of lower status. Tailors are all men. They are part of a guild. They will undergo a 4 to 7 year apprenticeship, at the end of which they generally specialise in a particular garment, be that coats or hose or breeches, or it depends on what is fashionable at the time. Women still have some work in the textiles industry. So they work, especially in spinning. Lots of women you'll see spinning when they aren't doing anything else because it gives a little bit more income to the household. They will also make shirts and smocks. These are the undergarments worn by everyone. They're made of linen, they're nice and washable. If you are a woman who's the head of a household, you'll probably be making the shirts and smocks for yourself and your husband and your children. You also have professional seamstresses who are also making shirts and smocks. They don't have a guild structure with which they can pass on this knowledge, that in the same way that tailors can pass down knowledge over the centuries. So as garments get more complex, you have the accumulated knowledge to help you know how to make certain things. If we look at this 16th century smock next to this nightgown, you will see that they are a very, very similar shape, and there is a reason for that. Smocks and shirts are made mainly out of rectangles, out of triangles, out of squares. They are generally cut according to the width of the linen, and they're easy enough to make. They're not too fitted. They can be made relatively quickly and without too much fabric. Fitting them to the linen saves wastage of fabric. If we look at the nightgown, we can see that it's very, very similar in shape. Where the difference is the seam at the shoulder. So there is no seam along here. The sleeve is cut in one with the body. These Japanese gowns are brilliant for showing off your status, and as with many things that can be made relatively cheaply but are still desirable, they trickle further down towards the middle classes. So it's informal attire, it's only worn in the house. It shows off your status, you've got the money to afford such a garment, you've got the time in which you can wear such a garment, and they can be made out of anything from relatively cheap cottons all the way up to expensive silks, depending on what you can afford. This informal gown in the 19th century becomes known much more as the banyan, tends to be the universal term for it, for men especially, and it varies between fairly loose fitting like a dressing gown that you might wear nowadays all the way to more fitted, quilted, it might have a bit of tailoring in, more like a long coat but to be worn inside rather than out of the house. We are going to leave banyans there, we're going to leave menswear there for now. I'm not going to come back to it, and we're going to focus much more on women's wear from now on, because the Japanese gown, as worn by women, begins evolving further through the 17th and into the 18th century. We now have the development of the Japanese gown into the Mantua. So, jumping sideways slightly, in the 17th century, formal dress tends to be very highly structured, highly fitted, smooth covered stays. You'd have a petticoat and then a train over the top. You might just have a petticoat, and the skirt that you wear with your stays will match them. This is expensive. Not only do you need a highly skilled stay maker to not only make stays that fit you, but make them so that they're smooth covered and get the fabric that is smoothly covering them to smoothly cover them rather than rucking up and becoming wrinkled in places. You also need to be able to afford a new set of stays for every new skirt or petticoat you have because they match. These are all made by highly skilled male tailors, and being highly skilled and male, it's going to cost more. Going back to the Japanese gown, in France it's commonly known as the manteau, which is a word that nowadays means coat. Manteau in the 17th century meant at least 3 different garments, if I remember rightly, but the Japanese gown is one of them, and that's because you put it on like a coat. However, by the 1670s it's evolving into the mantua. Now, the mantua is much like the manteau, it's the same as the Japanese gown, however, it's got pleats at the front and back of the bodice so that it's more fitted, and it's worn outside of the home. It's not just worn as informal wear. So this very, very simple shaping helps to show off your expensive fabrics if you've got expensive fabric. If not, it can show off your printed cotton or whatever it is that you can afford. And this development of wearing the manteau as a mantua outside of the home spreads very quickly across Europe. It's helped by the fact that for the first time in 1675, Louis XIV grants the ability to exist of the Seamstresses Guild. I don't think I've put that brilliantly, but I think you know what I mean. And this is probably one of the reasons behind the mantua suddenly becoming wildly popular. There are multiple reasons for that. It's cheap. You can, well, for a start, women are making it, and heaven forbid that we should pay women more than men. It's quick to make because it doesn't require a great deal of shaping. It can be made out of any fabric from cheap cottons all the way up to highly expensive imported silks. You only need one set of stays. Because it's worn over the top of the stays, nobody's going to see your stays, it doesn't need to match your stays, you don't need smooth covered stays. You can get away with the same set of stays with as many different mantuas as you like. You can also alternate which petticoats you wear with your mantua. As well as being cheap and quick to make and not requiring very much skilled labour, because of that, it's affordable across the social spectrum. Working class women can wear it, ladies at court can wear it, much to the irritation of Louis XIV, who doesn't think it's formal enough. And those of more middling sorts can not only wear it, but they can try and ape their betters with it. Middle class women would not be able to really get away with emulating the court dress worn by ladies of higher social status than them, because it's so obviously different to what they would normally wear, but they can copy the mantuas that are being worn by ladies at court. They're helped in this endeavour not only by the convenient timing of the formation of the female dressmakers guilds, but also by the fact that the first fashion magazine becomes available at this point in time in France. This is the Mercure Galant, and it shows you what various different men and women were wearing at court, complete with little labels as to what all of the different garments and hairstyles and shoes and so on are, and a little bit at the bottom which tells you where you might buy similar clothing from. So both the formation of the Seamstresses Guild is helping the rise of the Mantua, and also the Mantua is helping the rise of the Seamstresses Guilds. And the fashion magazines are helping both. By the beginning of the 18th century, female seamstresses are basically making the majority of female clothing. There are a few exceptions to that. We have stays are still being made by generally male stay makers. We have all sorts of satirical cartoons of male stay makers throughout the 18th century and how close they're getting to their female clients. We also have tailors tend to make more tailored garments like riding habits, for example. And court dress remains the same in that you still have your smooth covered stays and your petticoat and your train. You don't wear your mantua at court, it's still too informal, and those again are being made by skilled male dressmakers. I'm not suggesting that the female dressmakers are not skilled, it's simply that the garments that they're making required less skill than the male tailors at this point, and they are not helped by the fact that they don't have the accumulated knowledge behind them that the tailors do at this point. By the 18th century, these female seamstresses are very, very closely linked to these mantuas that they are making, to the extent that in England, mantua maker is the word for a female seamstress. Even later on, after we're not really making mantuas anymore, we're making other styles of dress, it's still mantua maker, it's mantua making. The mantua continues to evolve through the 18th century, you will be unsurprised to hear. It changes gradually at first, so these sleeves, which were originally cut as one with the body, begin being cut separately and then having to be fitted, and it begins being worn open at the bodice so that you can then display a stomacher. This is probably, at least in part, in order to save money on the sleeve part at least, because then you can cut your sleeves where they fit on the fabric and save money in terms of how much fabric you need to buy, whereas cutting them in one with the bodice will require a greater width of fabric. And when it comes to the stomacher, it both helps with the fitting and means that if you change shape slightly, then you can get away with pinning your mantua more tightly closed or less tightly closed. It also means that as a woman who is skilled at needlework, for example, you can show off your embroidery, and where a middle-class woman might not be able to afford to decorate the entirety of one of her mantuas, she might be able to afford to decorate a stomacher and then wear that with various different mantuas. From this evolution, we then get to the robe volant. So I'm not going to get into the whole hoop skirt thing at this point, but hoop skirts sort of make a return at the beginning of the 18th century, and this sort of turns into panniers. And the robe volant starts being worn over panniers, and these panniers gradually grow over time, as I'm sure you will be able to think of those ridiculous wide court dresses that we see later on in the 18th century. The robe volant starts being worn over the top of the beginning of panniers, and in order to show off the beautiful decorated imported fabrics in various things. Bizarre silks is one that springs to mind. I'm not going to go into that now, but I will leave a link to bizarre silks down below. In order to show off this fabric to its full extent, the pleats at the bodice are undone again, and it flows freely from shoulder all the way to the floor. From the robe volant, we then get to the sack-backed gown, which is still worn over panniers, but we then start sewing down the pleats that are at the front of the garment while still leaving the pleats at the back flowing free. So we've got from mantua to sack. However, we still have echoes of the kimono even at this point. To start off with, we've got the sleeve heads. Female seamstresses, when they began, were used to rectangles in the smocks and the shirts. These don't involve any kind of curved sleeve head, you just have the sleeve, which is flat, and then you have a gusset, which is a square. So when they start cutting the sleeves separately, they then start having to fit the sleeves to the client as they're fitting the dress, and this leads to some incredibly weirdly shaped sleeve heads as we go through the 18th century. They're not the nice smooth wave that we see in modern sleeve heads. They are, in some cases, incredibly bizarre. Here are some examples. We also have the direction of the pattern on the sleeve, so this is most easily seen on stripy dresses. Where you have vertical stripes on the bodice and the skirt, you will see that you have stripes that are horizontal going round and round the sleeve. This comes from the whole, if the sleeve and the bodice are cut as one, then the sleeve stripes would still go down if you hold the sleeve out like that, where the sleeve would be cut. And so now they're cut going round and round. This isn't universal, but it is something you can look out for on patterned dresses. Lastly, we have the whole bodice and skirt being connected. So if you look at even earlier on in the 18th century, we've got things like the robe à la anglaise, as it's often called. It's also called a nightgown because there is nothing like being confusing with terminology, where the back of the bodice is cut in one with the skirt, but the front is cut separately. The sack also evolves to have the front of the bodice and skirt cut separately, even when the back is all in one piece, but it takes a while for that to catch on. The kimono to the Japanese gown to the Mantua to the sack, it's something that's been documented. The evolution of the kimono to the Japanese gown, for example, is something that has been documented in articles and books, as has the evolution of the Japanese gown to the Mantua or the Mantua to the sack. But I have yet to see anything where there is a clear, coherent straight line drawn between the kimono through the Japanese gown and the Mantua to the sack. Nowhere seems to have done any kind of particular timeline, evolution, I'm not quite sure what you'd call it, between the four, so I thought it would be interesting to talk about the connectedness. And I think the interconnectedness of women dressmaking with the whole trade between Dutch and the Japanese and Portuguese, all really interesting as well, just how one thing that's seemingly completely irrelevant can affect something else. There's an awful lot more to delve into in terms of the whole history of the kimono, bizarre silks, all of the fabrics that we're importing for these gowns that I've been talking about. It's really fashionable to be importing Indian chintzes, but then Indian chintzes are affected by what the European market desires, and so we've got all sorts of exchange of ideas and culture going on that way. We've got bizarre silks, we've got painted Chinese silks, there's all sorts to talk about, but I've talked for long enough now. So I'll shut up and let you have a look at some of the sources I've attached, and possibly go and have a look at some of the other Silk Roads videos which are available at the moment.